I'm joined now by a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee who's been a vocal critic of the Attorney General, Democratic Senator Mazie Hirono of Hawaii. Senator, your reaction now to 24 hours worth of reporting across multiple outlets that there is some unease on the part of Mueller's team about the characterization of the report from Barr.
I think these concerns being expressed that the Barr 4-page letter did not accurately characterize the 400-page report makes it even more important and more critical that that report is made public.
Are there conversations, we know what's happening on the House, which is under Democratic control, and Jerry Nadler writing a letter pursuing it. Lindsey Graham has taken a fairly laissez-faire approach to this entire thing. Are there conversations on the Senate Judiciary side about how to deal with all of this?
Well, of course, the Democrats on that committee, as well as other Democrats, are very much focused on the need for the Mueller report and the underlying materials to be made public. So you have a president who started off by saying, sure, let's make it all public. You have the House that voted unanimously to make it all public, and suddenly there's all this, oh, well, the 4-page letter is good enough. What are they trying to hide? If I were the president and I thought that I was totally exonerated, I would want everything to be laid out for the public, and that's what he said, and now they're backing off that. So, you know, they're hiding the ball. What's going on? That's why the report has to be made public.
You voted against Barr to be Attorney General. Obviously, he passed nonetheless. How do you feel about that vote in the light of his actions in the past week and a half?
Well, we all know that he auditioned for the Attorney General's position with a 19-page unsolicited memo about how the president cannot be accused of obstruction of justice. And when the Mueller investigation did not draw a conclusion on that very issue, lo and behold, Barr steps in and says there's no obstruction of justice. Well, we all know what we saw and heard. We heard the president fire. We saw him, you know, firing Comey, wanting to fire Mueller, continuously calling this a witch hunt, which he still calls. And in fact, I think it's astounding that the president is now calling for an investigation into how this investigation began. Well, it began because the Russians tried to interfere with our elections. And don't you think it's, you know, it's the least we can expect from our president that he did not collude or conspire with a foreign country out to interfere with our elections? That's the least we can expect. But my goodness, what does he have to hide? Why doesn't he just go with what he originally said, which is let it all come out?
Is there anything that William Barr can do now to demonstrate to you that he does have integrity and that he is acting properly?
By releasing the report. And you know, when you start hearing from the very people who worked for 2 years on this investigation, expressing the kind of concerns that his 4-pager did not accurately reflect this investigation, I think that's cause for concern. And the way that he can remedy that is to make the report available and open.
Do you imagine a universe in which, I mean, I think in the House is obviously going to issue subpoenas for it. There's going to be back and forth now to Jerry Nadler asking for those summaries that we know have been prepared. Do you envision a universe in which the Senate Judiciary Committee hears witnesses, hears from people about this, talks to Barr about all this?
Well, Barr has offered to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee in May, so that's good. We'll be able to question him, although, well, I hope that we'll have time to review the, I hope as unredacted a version of the Mueller report as possible. But it's not as though Lindsey Graham, the chair of the Judiciary Committee, is jumping up and down and wanting to go down the path of full disclosure. So I'm very disappointed in that, but the American people can thank goodness that the House, at least in terms of a number of the chairs, are investigating various aspects of the Trump organization. So thank goodness. I think that's good for our country that we have some level of checks and balances, at least on the House side in particular.
Final question. Do you view these 3 stories or 4 stories coming out about the unease of the Mueller folks as effectively a warning, as effectively them saying that there will be further disclosures unless, in fact, the report comes out?
I think that that kind of question will always hang in the air unless the report is made public. And I think for the good of the public interest, that report needs to be totally transparent. Otherwise, these kinds of questions will always linger. And for the president to run around saying that he's been totally exonerated, we already know that that is not true. When you think about a foreign country interfering with our elections, and they're still doing it, by the way, I think that we need to know what's in that report so that we can draw our own conclusions.
All right, Senator Mazie Hirono, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.